Imagine you are standing on a cold, foggy beach in modern England. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. You hear the waves hitting the gray stones, and you hear people talking all around you. Their words feel natural and easy, like the air they breathe. But have you ever wondered why they speak this specific way? English is a language that almost died many times before it ever truly lived. It is a story of war, hidden secrets, and the incredible will to survive against all odds. Let's go far back into the mists of time. We must travel to a moment where the English language did not even have a name. It was a time of fire and iron, where words were as sharp as the swords men carried. In those days, a single defeat in battle could erase a culture and its voice forever. The journey of English is not a straight line, but a messy, beautiful struggle for breath. It began with small tribes moving across a dangerous gray sea toward an island they did not own. They carried simple words for the sun, the moon, and the earth beneath their heavy boots. These people did not know they were planting the seeds of a future global empire. Why did this one language survive while so many others vanished into the dust of history? The answer lies in its ability to change, to bend, and to steal from its enemies. It is a language built on the bones of many cultures, refusing to be silent. Before we see its glory, we must look at where it almost ended. Imagine a world where English was never spoken. Imagine if the words you are hearing now were considered a crime. This was almost the reality for the ancestors of this tongue. Every few decades, a new danger appeared on the horizon. The early speakers faced starvation, invasion, and the cold grip of winter. Yet, they held on to their sounds as if they were holy relics. Are you ready to journey with me? Let us begin our walk through the fire of history. We'll see how a few broken dialects became a bridge for billions of souls. The path is long and the nights are dark, but the story is worth every step. Pull your chairs a little closer to the fire, my friends. The night is quiet, and the spirits of the past are waiting to speak. He looked at the old notebook on the desk. I am not finished yet, he whispered to the shadows. This small, quiet determination is the heartbeat of the English language. It was not born in a palace, but in a hut. It was not polished by scholars, but sharpened by soldiers and farmers. Can you feel the weight of those ancient centuries in the words you use today? The ground was hard under his feet as he watched the ships arrive. He knew everything was about to change. The sounds of his childhood were about to be mixed with the sounds of strangers. This was the first great collision. It was a moment of fear, but also a moment of creation. Without this conflict, the English we know today would not exist. As the sun sets over the ancient cliffs, the first words are spoken. They are simple words for mother, father, and water. These sounds have traveled through 1,000 years of storms to reach your ears. They are the survivors of history's most difficult tests. But the hardest test was still to come, hidden in the dark forests of the future. The story begins in the dark, wet forests of northern Europe, long before the first stone cathedrals were built. Small groups of people, known as the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, lived in wooden huts near the sea. Their lives were hard, measured by the harvest and the strength of their wooden shields. They spoke a tongue that sounded like the cracking of dry branches and the heavy rhythm of the tide. These people looked across the water toward a green island called Britain. In the year 449, they began to cross the North Sea in long, narrow wooden boats. They carried their families, their iron tools, and their rough, powerful Germanic words. When they landed, they did not find an empty land, but a place filled with Celtic songs and Latin ghosts. The Roman Empire had recently left, leaving behind broken roads and silent temples. In the early morning mist, these newcomers built small villages and began to name the world around them. They used words like bread, house, and friend, which we still use at our dinner tables today. Each word was a physical thing, tied to the dirt and the wood of their daily lives. They sat around central fires at night, telling stories of monsters and heroes in a language we now call Old English. But this early language was very different from the one you are hearing right now. It was complex, with many difficult endings for every noun and verb, like a heavy suit of armor. There was no correct way to speak, only the way your village spoke near the river. Their world was small, and their language was a shield against the vast, unknown world outside the forest. The Saxons loved the land, and their words reflected the earth. They had names for every type of stream, every shape of hill, and every shade of the sky. They did not have words for philosophy or technology, but they had words for heart and soul. This was the foundation of the English spirit. It was a language born in the dirt, meant for people who worked with their hands. One young boy stood by the river, watching the water flow past his feet. He picked up a smooth, cold stone and whispered its name to himself. "Stan," he said, using the old word for stone. He felt the weight of the object and the weight of the word. To him, the word was as real as the stone itself. This connection between the world and the tongue was deep and unbreakable. His father taught him how to build a fence using oak wood and iron nails. As they worked, they used words that were short and strong. Work, hammer, nail, and wood. These words did not need to be beautiful. They needed to be functional. They were tools, just like the hammer in his hand. The language was growing, one village and one fence at a time. At night, the elders spoke of the great sea they had crossed to get here. They remembered the salt spray on their faces and the fear of the deep water. The children listened with wide eyes, learning the words for ocean and storm. These stories were the first books of the English people, held only in the memory of the tribe. The first great shadow fell upon the English language in the late 8th century, coming from the north. Imagine you are a monk in a quiet library on the coast of Northumbria. You are writing carefully on sheepskin paper. The only sound is the scratching of your pen. Suddenly, you hear a horn blow. You look out the window and see Viking longships appearing on the horizon like hungry wolves. Their colorful sails brought terror to the English coast. These invaders did not just want gold, they wanted land, and they brought their own language, Old Norse. For many years, it looked as though the English tongue would be completely destroyed by the Northmen. English kings fell, and English libraries were burned into black ash by the heat of Viking torches. The language faced its first major rejection as people were forced to speak the tongue of their conquerors. How can a language survive when its speakers are being erased from the map? This was a time of deep doubt and fear. The struggle was not just on the battlefield, but in the very way people communicated in the markets. A farmer speaking English had to trade with a soldier speaking Norse, and the complicated grammar began to break. Imagine the farmer holding a chicken. He wants to sell it, but the soldier does not understand his complex word endings. They had to simplify their speech just to buy a goat or a bag of grain. This was the first failure of English to remain pure. It could not stay the same while the world around it changed so violently. But in this failure, something incredible happened. Instead of dying, English began to absorb the words of the Vikings, making itself stronger and more flexible. We kept the English word house, but we took sky, knife, and window from the men who came to conquer. Every 30 seconds, the language was losing a piece of its old self, but gaining something new. Have you ever wondered why we say they are instead of the Old English version? We took the word they from the Vikings. This was a moment of survival through surrender. The language was learning its first lesson in resilience. To survive, it had to be willing to change. The old libraries were gone, but the language lived in the mouths of people who were simply trying to stay alive. The grammar became simpler, more direct, and easier for strangers to learn. This was an unexpected obstacle that turned into a secret advantage. The failure of the old complex grammar allowed English to become a tool for everyone on the island. He stood in the ruins of the burnt monastery and picked up a piece of charred wood. "We will speak again," he whispered to the wind. The Vikings were everywhere, and the English language was hiding in the shadows of small villages. It was a time of rejection and pain, but the roots were growing deeper into the soil. The greatest crisis arrived in the year 1066, a date that changed the sound of the world forever. William the Conqueror arrived from France, and at the Battle of Hastings, the last English-speaking king died with an arrow in his eye. Suddenly, English was no longer the language of power, law, or beauty. It became the language of the poor. French became the tongue of the castle, while English was buried in the mud of the fields. For 300 years, English was a ghost language, spoken only by servants and peasants in their cold huts. If you wanted to be a judge, a priest, or a lord, you had to speak French or Latin. The English language was ignored by the schools and the government, left to rot like an old tree. It was the lowest emotional moment for the culture, a time of silence and shame. Can you imagine living in a country where your native tongue is considered a sign of being uneducated? People whispered English in the stables while their masters laughed in French in the great halls. The very structure of the language began to shift under this pressure, losing its complex endings because no one was teaching them in schools. It was a language in chaos, drifting without a rudder in a stormy sea. Every day, it seemed more likely that English would simply disappear, replaced by a dialect of French. There were no English books being written and no English poems being read by the rich. The language was a flickering candle in a very large, very dark room. It survived only because the common people refused to let go of the words their mothers had taught them. "I have to try again," a farmer might have said quietly while looking at his ruined crops. He spoke the words of his ancestors even though they had no value in the marketplace of power. He touched the wooden handle of his plow, calling it by its English name. This was an act of quiet rebellion. The language did not die because it was too deeply rooted in the daily struggle of life. The crisis created a strange wall between two worlds on the same island. In the kitchen, the servants call the animal a cow or a pig in English. But in the dining hall, the lords called the meat beef or pork in French. We still have both words today, a permanent scar from this long period of social division. The language was being torn apart, but it was also being forced to grow in new, strange directions. Every 30 seconds of history felt like a slow erasure of the English identity. A young girl would hear a French song from a passing knight and feel that her own songs were small and ugly. There was no hope for English to ever return to the palace. It was a language of the dirt, the rain, and the tired heart. But beneath the surface, the heart was still beating. The people kept the fire alive in their small homes, away from the eyes of the French lords. They did not know that the very thing that made them poor would eventually make their language the most powerful in the world. They only knew they had to keep speaking. The turning point came not from a king, but from a terrible sickness that swept across the entire world. The Black Death arrived in the 14th century, killing millions and turning society upside down. Because so many people died, the poor workers who survived suddenly became very important and valuable. These workers spoke English, and for the first time in centuries, their voice had power in the economy. At the same time, England went to war with France for 100 years, and speaking French became the mark of an enemy. People began to feel a new pride in the rough, old tongue of their ancestors. In small courtrooms and village schools, English started to replace French as the language of the land. It was a conscious decision to return to the roots of the island. Then, a writer named Geoffrey Chaucer took a brave step by writing a great work of literature in common English. He chose to write about ordinary people, cooks, knights, and nurses using the words they actually spoke. This was a signal to the world that English was not just for the mud, it was for the heart and the mind. It was a bridge built between the low and the high. The language that emerged from this crisis was a strange, powerful mix of Germanic bones and French skin. We had two words for everything: ask and inquire, kingly and royal, smell and odor. This gave English a richness and a variety that no other language possessed. The crisis had not killed English. It had given it a massive, sophisticated vocabulary. Imagine a merchant walking through the busy streets of London in 1380. He hears the sound of English everywhere, from the docks to the markets. He touches a piece of fine wool and negotiates a price using the words of his childhood. He no longer feels the need to hide his language to appear important. This was a moment of deep psychological healing for a nation that had been silent for too long. We are one people again. A scholar might have written in his private diary. He looked at his old Latin books and then at the new English poems on his desk. He realized that the language of the people was becoming the language of the future. The tension between the French castle and the English field was finally beginning to disappear. Every 30 seconds, the language was reclaiming a new territory of life. It moved from the kitchen to the courtroom, and from the courtroom to the church. A young student sitting at a wooden desk would now hear his teacher explain the world in English. This was a discovery of identity that changed everything. The turning point was not just a historical event. It was a decision to continue despite the darkness. English had been pushed to the edge of extinction, but it refused to vanish. It used the pain of the past to build a more flexible and beautiful present. This resilience is what makes the language so special for us today. The next few centuries were a period of intense discipline and slow, steady growth for the language. As the Middle Ages ended, a strange phenomenon called the Great Vowel Shift occurred. It was a silent revolution that happened in the mouths of millions over several generations. People began to change the way they pronounced their long vowels, moving them higher up in the mouth. It was as if the entire nation decided to tune its instrument at the same time. People began to speak more like we do today, though their spelling remained a wild and lawless forest. In the 16th century, a young man from a small town began to write plays that would define the language forever. William Shakespeare did not just use English, he invented it, creating thousands of new words and phrases. He played with a language like a musician, pushing its limits and testing its strength. Every night in the theater, the English public learned new ways to express their love, their anger, and their fear. He took the rough clay of the peasant tongue and turned it into gold, but the struggle for a standard English was difficult, as every city still had its own confusing way of writing. There were no dictionaries, and a word could be spelled 5 different ways on a single page. Scholars argued about whether English was good enough to replace Latin in the world of science and philosophy. It took years of practice and the work of many lonely writers to prove that English could be precise. This was the long struggle of a language trying to find its professional voice. Imagine a printer in London, his hands covered in black ink, looking at a wooden press. He has to decide which spelling of a word to use for his books. Should it be dog, or dog, or dog? Every choice he made helped to lock the language into a permanent form. This slow progress was happening in shops and printing houses across the country. It was a time of discipline where the wild growth of the past was being trimmed into a formal garden. How can we understand each other? A traveler might have asked in a busy London inn. He noticed that a man from the north and a man from the south could barely speak the same tongue. This lack of unity was a constant challenge. The language needed a standard, a common ground where everyone could meet. This was not achieved overnight, but through centuries of slow, patient practice. Every 30 seconds of this era was a step toward the modern world. A scientist would write down a discovery, searching for an English word that didn't exist yet. He would reach back into Latin or Greek and pull a new word into the English family. This was the era of the inkhorn words, where thousands of new terms for medicine, law, and art were born. The language was expanding its mind, preparing for a global stage. The long struggle was also about the Bible. When the King James Version was published, it gave the people a shared set of beautiful, poetic phrases. These words entered the hearts of the common people, giving them a high language for their deepest feelings. It proved that English could be as holy and as grand as any ancient tongue. The doubt of the past was finally fading away. He sat at his desk, staring at a blank sheet of paper, his quill trembling. He was trying to compile the first great dictionary, a task that seemed impossible for one man. He had to capture a living, breathing thing and pin it to the page. This was the ultimate act of discipline. The language was no longer just a collection of sounds, it was a library of human experience. The breakthrough happened when English took to the sea, following the wooden ships that sailed to every corner of the earth. From the rocky shores of North America to the heavy heat of India, the language moved with the explorers, traders, and soldiers. It was no longer confined to a small, rainy island in the North Atlantic. English was becoming a global passenger, picking up new words from every culture it touched. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution began in the heart of England, creating a desperate need for new technical words. English became the language of steam engines, smoky factories, and modern science, making it essential for anyone who wanted to succeed. The world was changing fast, and English was the fast-growing vine that wrapped itself around every new invention. Public attention turned to London as the center of a vast empire, and the language followed the money. People in far-off lands began to learn English to communicate, to trade, and to share their own stories. In America, the language developed its own energetic rhythm, shedding old traditions and embracing the future. The breakthrough was not just about power, but about the sheer number of people who now claimed English as their own. It was a language that belonged to the world, not just to the English. By the time the 20th century arrived, English was the language of the sky, used by pilots across all borders. It was the language of the movies, the radio, and eventually the digital code of the internet. It had achieved a level of public recognition that no other tongue in history had ever reached. From a dying forest dialect, it had become the invisible thread connecting the human race. Imagine a young sailor standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He holds a compass in his hand and calls out a direction in English. Thousands of miles away, another man in a busy port repeats that same word. They have never met, and they come from different worlds, but they are connected by a single sound. This was the moment the language truly broke through its old boundaries. Is the whole world speaking like us now? A traveler might have wondered as he stepped off a boat in a foreign land. He heard the familiar rhythm of his mother tongue being spoken in a market far from home. It was a discovery that felt both strange and wonderful. The language had become a global bridge, strong enough to carry the weight of 1,000 different cultures. Every 30 seconds, a new word from a different continent was being invited into the English dictionary. Words for food, for clothes, and for ideas were flowing into the language like water into a great lake. This was not a conquest of words, but a celebration of global connection. The language was no longer a fixed thing. It was a living, breathing map of the human journey. He stood on the shore of a new continent and watched the sunrise. He knew that the words he spoke today would be spoken by millions of people he would never meet. This was the ultimate achievement. The English language had survived the forest, the Vikings, and the French to become the voice of a new, connected world. As we look back at this long journey, what is the true meaning of the English story? It is a story of resilience, showing us that our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths. English survived because it was not afraid to change, to fail, or to admit that it needed other cultures. It is a beautiful, messy mirror of the human experience itself, always growing, always learning. Every time you speak a sentence in English, you're using a piece of history that is thousands of years old. You're using the breath of Viking warriors, the thoughts of French lords, and the dreams of English poets. The language is a living thing, and as you learn it, you become a part of its continuing evolution. It does not belong to a king or a country anymore. It belongs to you. The lesson of English is that connection is more important than purity. By opening its doors to new words and new people, the language became a home for everyone. It teaches us that we do not have to be perfect to be powerful, and we do not have to stay the same to stay true to ourselves. Our struggles and our mistakes are often the very things that make us rich and diverse. Imagine sitting by a fire at the end of a long, cold day. You feel the warmth on your face, and you hear the crackle of the wood. You realize that your voice is part of a global conversation that has been happening for 15 centuries. You are not just learning grammar, you are learning how to connect your soul to the rest of the world. I am part of this story now, you might say to yourself in the quiet of the night, and you are right. Every student, every traveler, and every dreamer who picks up this language adds a new chapter to the book. The language is no longer a tool of conquest, but a tool of healing and understanding. Thank you for sitting with me by the fire today and walking through the mists of time. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that you are carrying an ancient, global treasure in your mind. Every word is a bridge, and every sentence is a step toward a wider world. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and keep dreaming. This script is based on real historical research, using sources from the Oxford English Dictionary, the historical works of David Crystal, and the British Library Archives. Some dialogue and emotional details have been reconstructed based on linguistic history and academic research. The purpose of this video is not to glorify conquest, but to honor the resilience of the human spirit and the shared history of all who speak this tongue.